USPAP 7-hour National Update Course 2022 through 2023. You missed a question in the pre-course assessment that related to the content on this page. Please study this information on this page carefully so you will be better able to answer questions about this material on upcoming quizzes. A real property appraiser has agreed to complete an appraisal assignment on a 4-unit residence for mortgage financing. The appraiser is required by state law to comply with USPAP in this assignment. The client asks the appraiser to prepare a narrative style report instead of using a pre-printed report form. With which part or parts of USPAP does the appraiser need to comply? Page 9, Step 1. Step 1 is to define the problem. That's highlighted. In order to narrow the focus and provide context, there may be additional questions that need to be answered. In this case, there are several such questions. Since the question is, may I do that? It appears the person who is asking the question is an appraiser. Is that correct? The person asking, may I do that, is an appraiser. That's highlighted. Since the words client and borrower are used, this appears to be a valuation service, and the individual is acting as an appraiser. That's highlighted. Is that correct? The individual is acting as an appraiser. Since the request from the client was to change the borrower's name, this appears to be regarding an appraisal assignment. That's highlighted. Correct? This is regarding an appraisal assignment. Since the word borrower was used, which is a common term in real property mortgage lending, is the appraiser a real property appraiser? That's highlighted. And is the client a mortgage lender? The appraiser is a real property appraiser. The client is a mortgage lender. Since this is a real property appraiser, it can be assumed they have a state-issued appraisal credential and thus are required to follow USPAP. That's highlighted. For this assignment, by law, the appraiser is required to comply with USPAP for this assignment. For this example, we will assume the state requires the appraiser to comply with USPAP. Since the client is a lender, the lender has requested a written appraisal report. That's highlighted. Correct? The client has requested an appraisal report. Now, we have confirmed the following. Number 1, This is a real property appraiser. That's highlighted. Number 2, the appraiser is required to comply with USPAP. That's highlighted. Number 3, this is regarding an appraisal assignment. That's highlighted. And number 4, the assignment will result in a written appraisal report. Appraisal report. That's highlighted. Thus, we start by concluding that the appraiser, at a minimum, will need to comply with standards 1 and 2, as well as the ethics rule, competency rule, scope of work rule, record keeping rule, and the jurisdictional exemption rule. Some of these questions and conclusions may seem obvious, but the importance of learning to ask them will become more important as the questions increase in complexity. On the next page, we will continue with our definition of the problem. End of page. Comment. This is not a question sentence. Since this is a real property appraiser, it can be assumed they have a state-issued appraisal credential and thus are required to follow USPAP for this assignment. It's a question by Big Bear Van at yahoo.com. Page 10. Chapter 5. Where does the answer to your question live? Step 1 continued. Let's continue to gather more possible details about the question so we can arrive at an answer. When was the request to change the borrower's name received? Has the appraiser yet agreed to even perform the assignment, or are the appraiser and the client only in communication about this detail? Has the appraiser begun the development of the appraisal but not yet delivered a report? Or has an appraisal report already been delivered? For this example, we will say the client asked for the change after. That's highlighted. The report was delivered. Does USPAP require that the borrower be named in the report? USPAP does not include any requirements that address who an appraiser identifies as a borrower. The term borrower is a client term, not a USPAP term. USPAP Standards Rule 1-2, Problem Identification, and Standards Rule 2-2, Content of an Appraisal Report, only require that the appraiser identify the client and any other intended users. So, does that mean the borrower might be an intended user? A search of the word borrower in the 2020 through 2022 USPAP publication leads us to FAQ 138. Are borrowers intended users? Which advises that being a borrower does not make them an intended user of the appraisal report. Conclusion: while in the experience of real property appraisers, it is not common for a lender client to identify their borrower as an intended user of the appraisal report, it is still a possibility. Thus, before concluding that you may change the borrower's name in the report, let's check some resources in the USPAP publication about intended users. End of page. Quiz. Number 1. A real property appraiser has been asked to prepare an appraisal on a 2-unit residence for mortgage financing. Instead of reporting the results on a secondary market report form, the client asks the appraiser to prepare a narrative style report. The appraiser is required by state law to comply with USPAP in this assignment. With which part or parts of USPAP does the appraiser need to comply? Ready, set, go. A, all of the rules in USPAP only. B, all of USPAP including the advisory opinions and FAQs. C, standards 1 and 2 in USPAP only. Or D, all of the rules in USPAP as well as standards 1 and 2. I'm going to go D. Yes, good job. You answered correctly. So remember, number 1, a real property appraiser has been asked to prepare an appraisal on a 2-unit residence for mortgage financing. Instead of reporting the results on a secondary market report form, the client asks the appraiser to prepare a narrative style report. The appraiser is required by state law to comply with USPAP in this assignment. With which part or parts of USPAP does the appraiser need to comply? You said all of the rules in USPAP, as well as standards number 1 and 2, and that is correct. Number 2, you are answering a USPAP question. As part of the process, you may need to answer several additional questions in order to properly define the problem. Ready, set, go. A, true or false? I'm going to go true. And you answered correctly. Good job. So remember, you are answering a USPAP question. As part of the process, you may need to answer several additional questions in order to properly define the problem. You said true, and that was correct. You missed a question in the pre-course assessment that related to the content on this page. Please study this information on this page carefully so you will be better able to answer questions about this material on upcoming quizzes. An appraiser is searching for the phrase acting as an appraiser using the search feature in the electronic version of USPAP. What is the appraiser likely to find? Page 11, Step 2. Step 2 in the process is identify sources for the solutions. That's highlighted. In this situation, we will examine two terms that are critical in our question, and we'll look for them in the USPAP publication. Identity user, what the fuck? Identity user? That's what it is, yeah. INTENDEND. Identity user. There it is. Client condition or assignment condition. Identity user. The index to the 2020 through 2022 USPAP publication, page 350, lists several references to identity users. These conclude a specific definition for identity user on page 4 of USPAP Advisory Opinion 36. That's highlighted. Identification and disclosure of client, intended use and intended users, and FAQs 135, 136, 137, and 138. That's highlighted. Searching the 2020 through 2022 e-USPAP publication reveals the phrase intended user. Appears so many times that in this instance, without searching for a more focused phrase, using the search feature is less helpful than it was for the phrase acting as an appraiser. FAQ 138. Directly confronts the main question. The title is Are Borrowers Intended Users? This FAQ cites the comment to Standards Rule 2-2A, Roman numeral 2, which states a party receiving a copy of an appraisal report in order to satisfy disclosure requirements does not become an intended user of the appraisal unless the appraiser identifies such party as an intended user. The index on page 352 lists several references to revisions of reports. The most relevant reference is for page 252, date of revised report, which is FAQ 152. Client condition or assignment condition. Since it is the client who required at the time of the assignment a condition for the appraisal report to state the borrower's name, and this is not a USPAP requirement. It may just be the scope of work rule that will help solve this problem. The scope of work rule, which is only applicable to appraisal and appraisal review assignments, states under problem identification that the appraiser must gather and analyze information about the assignment elements necessary to properly identify the appraisal problem to be solved. For an appraisal assignment, the appraiser is required to identify assignment conditions. But what are assignment conditions? The definition of assignment conditions states that these consist of other conditions that affect the scope of work. This means only things that affect the scope of work are assignment conditions. Would the name of a borrower impact the scope of work? No. If stating the borrower's name in an appraisal report is not an assignment condition, what is it? Searching for the phrase client condition leads us to FAQ 146, assignment conditions versus client conditions. Let's look at FAQ 146 on the next page. End of page.
Question. I agreed to perform a market value appraisal of a property with proposed improvements under the following client-imposed conditions. A. The appraiser must develop at least 2 approaches to value. B. The property must be appraised as if it had been completed per plans and specifications as of the date of inspection. C. The report must include photographs of abutting properties. D. The report must include an as-is market value for the subject property. And E. The report must be transmitted to the client within 30 days of the agreement to perform the appraisal. I am unsure whether all of these are actual assignment conditions as defined in USPAP, and which may be client conditions only. Which, if any, of these conditions are assignment conditions? Response. The definition of assignment conditions includes other conditions that affect the scope of work. So the question is, which of these conditions affects the appraiser's scope of work? Only items A, B, and D are assignment conditions under USPAP. In the assignment upon which this question is based, the client requires that the borrower's name appear in the appraisal report. However, because it does not affect the scope of work, it is not an assignment condition. It is therefore a client condition, that is, something that the client requires that is not part of the scope of work for the assignment. Step 3 is conclude the answer. From the USPAP publication sources reviewed, you can conclude that if you have not identified the borrower as an intended user, then changing the name of the borrower in the report is not an alleged violation of USPAP. In fact, USPAP does not require that the name of the borrower appear anywhere in your report. Providing the name of the borrower is not an assignment condition. Rather, it is a client condition. The client's request to include the borrower's name in the appraisal report is a client condition. Changing the borrower's name does not affect the scope of work. In other words, the request to change the borrower's name does not change the development of credible assignment results. Such a request does not result in a new assignment. Further, appraisers should consider the timing of the request to change the borrower's name. In this scenario, the request was made after the report was delivered to the client. A search of the 2020-2022 e-USPAP publication for the phrase date of revised report leads to FAQ 152, which advises the revised report should include a new date of report. FAQ 152, date of revised report. Question: in response to a client request, I recently made some minor edits to a report. The assignment results were unchanged, but I corrected a few minor typographical errors and entered the census tract number that had been omitted from the original report. Because the results did not change, this was essentially the same report, so I did not change either the effective date or the date of the report. My client now wants me to resubmit the report with the current report and certification date. Should the new report be dated as of the date revised? Response: yes. The date of the revised report should be the date that it is completed and transmitted to the client. According to USPAP, a report is a communication transmitted to the client upon completion of an assignment. Since, in this case, a new report is being completed and transmitted, it should be dated accordingly. This is true even when the only changes are minor corrections and the assignment results are unchanged. In addition, if the certification is dated, that date should also be based on the date the report is resubmitted. In the resubmission, the appraiser is certifying the content of the revised report, so any certification date cannot precede the completion of the revisions.
Page 15. Complete the request. Based on the answer to this question, the appraiser may indeed change the borrower's name in the appraisal report, even though the report has already been transmitted to the client. It would be reasonable to expect that the appraiser would change the name of the borrower in the report, follow acceptable and agreed upon client requirements for form or format of how that change will be stated in the report. Revise the report date to reflect the date of the revised report. Transmit the report to the client. Place a true copy of the appraisal report in the work file. Keep the work file for a minimum of 5 years. End of page.